First of all, before we even get started, I salute you, sir.
His goal is to make a couple $1 billion this, and then I want to be president.
You want to be president of the United States?
Yeah, I think I can do it.
I want to live right now when I can do whatever the I want. Nobody tell me what to do.
I went broke, so it was just like, it was a wild ride.
Dan Bilzerian used to be that guy, the internet's wild card fantasy. Rugged beard, jacked body, puffing cigars like royalty, surrounded by women in bikinis and billion-dollar toys. From private jets to gun-packed mansions, he crafted a lifestyle that made jaws drop and followers hit like without thinking twice. He wasn't just flexing for fun. Dan built an empire on being the reckless alpha. Wild yacht parties, check. Exotic cars lined up like trophies, you bet. Girls, guns, gambling. It was the whole fantasy package that had dudes everywhere dreaming they were living through him. But now, that fantasy is crumbling hard. Despite his usual bravado and nothing's wrong energy on X, people are jumping ship fast. He lost a brutal 120,000 followers overall, and the bloodbath hit peak levels on March 31st, 2024, when 5,419 people unfollowed him in just one day. That's not just a drop, that's a free fall. Over the next 6 months, another 60,000 followers ghosted him. And this wasn't just a popularity hit, it destroyed his business. His company's stock crashed so badly, it got yanked off the exchange completely. The money dried up, the hype faded, and suddenly, the king of clout was on the ropes. Now Dan's scrambling to stay relevant. And guess who he's mimicking? Andrew Tate. Yup, Dan's launching a Sigma Society movement, pushing macho self-help courses and wannabe alpha manuals. From Playboy to Pitchman, the pivot is real. But that was just the beginning of Dan's downfall. Things got uglier, way uglier. The flashy cars, wild mansion parties, and endless flexing. Turns out, it was all smoke and mirrors. That entire lifestyle he shoved in everyone's face was mostly fake. And once the curtain got pulled back, the legend of the Instagram king completely fell apart. Then came the big guns. The SEC, the actual U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, opened a full-blown investigation into Dan's money moves. That's when the fantasy officially turned into a legal nightmare. And get this, the biggest twist of all hit in 2024, when Dan sued his own father. The same dad he spent years swearing never gave him a dime? Yeah, that one. Dan suddenly claimed Paul Bilzerian and other company shareholders were secretly plotting to kick him out of Ignite, the same company where Dan was once the untouchable poster boy with half-naked models and dollar-sign branding. So how did a guy who got expelled from high school for bringing a gun to school, washed out of Navy training, and somehow finessed a life of luxury, end up dragged by the internet as a fake and a fraud? Here's how. Back in July 2018, just a few months after Ignite launched, Dan quietly fired Curtis Heffernan, the company president, and not just some nobody. Heffernan was a corporate heavyweight, straight from Procter & Gamble. But Curtis wasn't about to take it lying down. He turned around and sued Dan for wrongful termination. That lawsuit didn't just ruffle feathers, it blew the whole empire wide open. With one court filing, Curtis Heffernan dropped a bomb that shattered Dan Bilzerian's entire brand. Turns out, the Instagram playboy hadn't built a business empire, he had faked one. According to the lawsuit, Dan never bought that insane $65 million mansion he flexed so hard online. Nope, it was all cap. The place was rented for $200,000 a month. That truth alone had people in shock. But what really sent the internet into a frenzy was the pure comedy of the timing. Just 1 week before that truth dropped, Dan had proudly walked Kevin O'Leary, the big money mogul from Shark Tank, through the mansion, bragging that he dropped $65 million to own it. And when Kevin started asking smart business questions, like how Dan was writing off taxes on the property, Dan froze up. His face said it all. The confidence cracked. And instead of answering, he tossed out some awkward joke to dodge the question. That moment got replayed everywhere, but the hits kept coming. Dan had always painted a picture of being surrounded by women who adored him, followers who worshipped him. Nah, turns out a bunch of those so-called fans and bombshells were paid to be there. The receipts? Right there in Ignite's expense reports. $26,000 labeled as image promotion. And that was just the start. When the full list of Dan's company-covered expenses came out, it was wild. Almost $900,000 spent just to keep the illusion alive. As if slapping a logo on a champagne glass magically turned a wild party into a business expense, that was Dan Bilzerian's actual strategy. It was bold, ridiculous, and somehow it almost worked. According to Curtis Heffernan, the board even tried to pressure him into greenlighting all those shady expenses. But Curtis wasn't going down with the ship. He flat out refused. He even warned Dan to stop renting that $200,000 a month mansion, especially during the height of the pandemic, while the world was locked down and people couldn't even see their own families. Dan was out here throwing packed pool parties. Like the rules didn't apply to him. It wasn't just reckless, it was straight up illegal under COVID restrictions. So how did Dan react? Did he chill out? Not even close. Dan went full delusional, appointed himself chairman of the board, and reportedly said, "I'll throw even more pool parties and keep using that mansion." Like, what? Then came the smear campaign. Dan suddenly accused Heffernan of using illegal substances during a board meeting. Zero proof, no receipts. But it was enough to get him fired from Ignite. That's how they tried to silence him. By June 2020, Ignite refused to comment officially on the case, and Dan brushed it all off in a cocky statement to TMZ. But the twist? It wasn't journalists who confirmed Heffernan's story. It was anonymous former Ignite staff who spilled everything. They backed up the claims 100%, that the company wasn't funding innovation or product growth. No, it was paying for Dan's wild lifestyle. From jet rides to branded bikinis. If Dan wanted it, the company paid, just as long as the logo was somewhere in the shot. At one point, it felt like every single thing Dan touched got charged to Ignite's tab. Exotic trips, models, parties, fireworks, all of it. And the wildest part, none of it had anything to do with actual business. Yet Dan still funneled invoices through the company like it was a bottomless piggy bank. All those jaw-dropping Instagram moments, turns out they were just paid for illusions, footed by clueless investors who had no idea they were bankrolling Dan's ego. And when people started calling him out, Dan didn't go quiet. Nope, he clapped back hard on X with his usual cocky energy. Some journalists said Ignite was funding my life, which I've been going hard for 10 years and been famous for going hard for 7. I started Ignite 2 years ago, raised a found $100 million, and I own the majority of the company. Suck my... Yeah, he really said that. But even with all the chest puffing, the numbers don't lie, and they were ugly. Ignite's 2020 annual report showed a $69 million loss, while only pulling in $9.7 million in revenue. That's not a setback. That's a full-blown disaster. The stock tanked from $2.50 down to just 28 cents, losing almost 90% of its value. Investors, furious. The public, embarrassed they ever believed the hype. In October 2020, desperate to save face, Dan tried to play smart, comparing Ignite's losses to Uber, posting, "Uber is worth $80 billion. It has never had a profitable month since it started, and it lost over $5 billion in one quarter last year." Sounds clever, right? But here's the difference. Uber isn't blowing $75,000 on private paintball fields or renting mansions to live stream pool parties full of influencers and tequila bottles. Dan Bilzerian built his fame on wild parties, jaw-dropping excess, and the image of a man who had it all. But once Curtis Heffernan dropped that lawsuit, the truth hit like a wrecking ball. Everything Dan showed off was rented. The jets, the girls, the giant mansions, all fake, all funded through company money, like props in one big scam. That mysterious playboy lifestyle people had worshipped since 2014, it was nothing more than a marketing trick designed to fool the masses. Once the illusion cracked, it completely vanished. And you could literally see the downfall happening in real time. By May 2020, Dan's Instagram, the very core of his brand, went almost silent. No parties, no flexing, no chaos. For someone who lived for attention, this sudden quiet was straight up suspicious. And followers noticed his numbers started dropping fast. The empire wasn't just slowing down, it was in free fall. Whispers started swirling in the media. Was the Instagram king actually going broke? Of course, Dan fired back with the same over-the-top arrogance. He posted a skeleton graphic and captioned it, "All those dumbass journalists still waiting for Ignite to go bankrupt." Classic Dan, smug and sarcastic, but the receipts, they told a different story. Even though Ignite technically never filed for bankruptcy, things were far from okay. In 2019, the company posted a $69 million loss. And in 2020, it dropped another massive chunk of cash. These weren't loud losses, but they were brutal. The kind that kill a company slow and quiet. Then came the twist that had everyone doing double takes. Reports started surfacing that Dan's dad, Paul Bilzerian, was actually running Ignite from the shadows. For most companies, shady internal emails might barely make headlines. but not when your shadow boss is Paul Bilzerian. With Ignite, it wasn't just bad optics. It was a ticking legal time bomb. Paul Bilzerian isn't some harmless behind-the-scenes consultant. This man was convicted of securities fraud back in 1991, hit with a jaw-dropping $62 million fine, and even did prison time for it. To this day, he's only paid $3.7 million, always claiming he's too broke to pay the rest. But somehow, he's still floating around high-stakes companies like nothing happened. Dan, of course, has always pretended they're not close. He's tried to sell the idea that he's self-made, with no help from his disgraced dad. But guess what? Receipts never lie. Investigative reports exposed that Paul had sent thousands of emails to Ignite execs, acting like an unofficial director. That's a major problem because Paul's SEC ban for life blocks him from participating in any U.S. public company. So if he was calling shots behind the scenes, that's a serious federal violation. But here's the kicker. The guy known for fraud might have been the only reason Ignite didn't fully crash. Paul allegedly came in like a ghost CFO, slashing 75% of Ignite's advertising budget, pulling the plug on those cash-burning parties, and ending Dan's brand as a lifestyle spending spree. Suddenly, Ignite reported its first ever profit in the final quarter of 2020. That's right, the same company that was hemorrhaging millions turned a corner after the chaos was reined in. The numbers flipped, partly due to COVID-19 restrictions killing party expenses. But Paul's cuts played a major role too. By 2021, Ignite's stock made a shocking climb from 28 cents to $1.11. Dan Bilzerian tried to stage a comeback, flashing that same smug grin on Instagram, announcing he was going to sell Ignite. But instead of triumph, the move felt like deja vu. Same old illusion, just with a different filter. And by 2022, the illusion had finally collapsed for good. Ignite's value tanked, and no mansion party or yacht stunt could distract the markets anymore. Then, the SEC came in swinging, officially suing Ignite for failing to turn over documents tied to a major investigation. The feds weren't just sniffing around for fun. They alleged accounting fraud, suggesting Ignite had inflated revenue numbers for the very quarter it claimed to be magically profitable. The final months of 2020, that miracle turnaround, yeah, it might have been smoke and mirrors. When the stock hit rock bottom, Dan didn't offer any real answers. Instead, he just delisted Ignite from the stock exchange. No explanation, no statement, just vanished. And when reporters came calling, Dan didn't show up, but his dad did. 2 months later, Paul Bilzerian popped up in a rare interview with MJ Beast Daily, calling himself an unpaid consultant for Ignite. But let's be real, Paul was doing the talking because Dan ghosted. He admitted that around 90% of Ignite stock was controlled by Dan and his friends, and subtly shaded his own son, saying, Dan might have thought being famous meant he should own a company. Ouch. Paul even admitted the company never delivered real value, just a loud brand that attracted regulators, lawsuits, and constant media heat. And Dan? Still trying to keep the dream alive. He kept posting on Ignite's Instagram, bragging that the products were America's top sellers. But nobody was buying it. Not the items, not the hype, because the real story was buried in the comments. Dan Bilzerian's empire didn't just crumble, it turned on him. His bold claims about Ignite's success were instantly torn apart by real customers, who flooded the comment sections calling him out. Followers clowned him, and every day more disappeared from his shrinking fan base. The man who once ruled Instagram like a digital god was now getting roasted in real time. And just when you thought the saga couldn't get messier, Dan sued his own father in early 2025. That twist hit everyone sideways. After all, Paul Bilzerian, despite his shady past, was the one who actually cleaned up Dan's mess. Paul slashed costs, scrapped useless marketing, and somehow got Ignite to turn a profit, all while Dan kept playing the flashy frontman on social media. But behind that fake glam life, serious drama was clearly brewing. Dan's lawsuit accused Paul of illegally removing him from Ignite's board of directors and using Dan's personal image without consent. And he wasn't just filing paperwork for show. Dan demanded $50 million in damages, claiming his own father had schemed to steal the brand out from under him. Suddenly, this wasn't just about failed business. It was family war. The guy who once called himself the king of excess was now fighting for control of the empire he said he built, against the very man who actually kept it afloat. What started as a brand soaked in alpha male energy, private jets, and pool parties was now a courtroom drama filled with betrayal and accusations. But the deeper you look, the clearer it gets. This wasn't just about who was right or wrong. It was about how fragile power, fame, and family loyalty really are. Dan lived like the star of an action movie. But in the end, the biggest plot twist wasn't about guns or girls. It was his own dad turning into the final boss. And just like that, the lights dimmed, the party stopped, and Dan Bilzerian, the ultimate alpha fantasy, had to face the truth without the filters. No models, no mansion, no fireworks, just a mic and a moment of honesty. On the Skinny Confidential podcast, Dan finally broke character and said what no one expected. I'm tired of being hated, a rare confession that hit harder than any flex. For a man who built his entire image on being untouchable, that line exposed everything. Because when your whole empire is built on bravado and illusion, the downfall isn't just public, it's personal. Fame didn't just cost Dan his reputation, it left him isolated, with no real version of himself left behind the curtain. Now Dan's chasing a new dream, Sigma Society, a so-called brotherhood where he preaches about what it means to be a real man. But how real is that advice coming from someone who rented every moment of his life? From paid jets to paid followers, the whole thing was staged like a reality show with no reality. So the big question remains, is this Dan's shot at redemption, or is it just another grift in a new package? Another fantasy sold to men searching for meaning. Let us know what you think in the comments. Is Sigma Society legit, or just Dan's final illusion? If you made it this far, sound off in the comments. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe if you want more deep dives like this.